population of Muslims of India is 218 million right now. Out of 280 million, 80% of them are below poverty line. They work hard and they earn less than $1 a day.
Whether it be education, whether it be healthcare, whether it be social welfare, whether it be religious type of work, we are the only ones in states. IMRC is the only organization that is providing complete services from birth to death.
There's no overhead. There's no other charity, to my knowledge, which gives 100% of the donation back.
Welcome to the 58th Annual ISNA Convention. Reimagine and rebuild with renewed resolve.
Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to the 2021 ISNA Convention session titled, A Renewed Commitment to Promote Global Harmony. In this session, neither our allies are eternal, nor our enemies perpetual. Rather, our interests are eternal and perpetual, and the pandemic taught us to promote our shared interests efficiently. By extending similar wisdom, the 58th Convention plans to address some of these interests, such as the climate crisis, threats of nuclear weapons, growing geopolitical tensions, new forms and patterns of violence, and divided interests with growing worldwide unrest to further global harmony. Our first speaker today is Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool. Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool, in 1980, matriculated at Livingstone High School in Claremont, Cape Town. He later enrolled at the University of West Cape for a BA degree. In 1984, after completing a higher diploma in education with the University of Cape Town, he took a teaching position at Spine Road High School. From 1991 to 1994, he was assistant to the rector of the University of the Western Cape. After university, Rasool joined the Western Cape branch of the United Democratic Front and served as its provincial secretary for 3 years. In 1984, he served as national secretary of the Call of Islam, which had strong ties with the UDF. He held this position until 1994. From 1994 to 1998, he was provincial treasurer for the ANC and member of the Executive Council of Western Cape Legislature. He remains the chairperson of the ANC in the Western Cape. On the 22nd of April 2004, President Thabo Mbeki appointed Rasool to his current position of Premier of the Western Cape Province.
A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. My respected leaders of the Islamic Society of North America, delegates to this convention, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh, and to my fellow panelists, I also greet you in the name of peace. This is a very unusual but very important convention that ISNA is holding, coming in the midst of a pandemic, coming in a global moment of transition, coming in a moment of decision for the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, not only in North America, but indeed all over the world, not only where we are minorities, but certainly also where the majority of Muslims are also located. The topic of global harmony is an absolutely critical one. We are in a background of distemper in this world, brought on partly by the COVID-19 pandemic, but it is mostly because of the pre-existing conditions of inequality, of climate change, of poverty, of raging conflicts, of a range of pathologies that have affected the world. But the Muslim community globally have been germane and central to the idea of this distemper, not only by virtue of what some of us have done in the name of Islam and Muslims, but also by virtue of what historically and currently is being done to Muslims. And so I want to make the proposition right at the outset that for global harmony to exist, it critically means that we must bring peace to the collective Muslim soul. And I base this on a very broad thesis that since World War II, Muslims have been central to many of the conflicts. Again, not only by what has been done by us, but often what has been done to us. Muslims have been in the eye of the storm. We have fought battles. We have fought battles against colonialism. Algeria is a classical example, but it also includes Indonesia and many other Muslim countries. We have fought battles against occupation. Particularly Palestine remains a blight on the global community because it remains the center of occupation of Muslim lands with permission from the powerful in the world. We have fought battles against invaders, whether they were the Soviet invaders in Afghanistan or the US invaders in more latter times. We have fought battles against our own dictators, Iraq and many other places of the Arab Spring attest to that. We have fought battle against various authoritarians. The Arab Spring, particularly countries like Egypt, have shown that authoritarianism has a kind of resilience in the Muslim world that is unknown anywhere else in the world. We have fought for freedom and civil rights in Muslim countries that may have had elections, that may have been illiberal, but Muslims have certainly fought for civil rights, for democracy, for a say in their lives. We have also battles around sectarianism. So many geopolitical battles are presented as battles between Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims, between Sufis and Deobandis, and many other forms of sectarianism. We have been involved in global proxy wars for hegemony in the region of the Middle East, and so Yemen has become a battleground. And we have been involved in internecine conflicts, whether as far back as the partitions of Pakistan from the Indian subcontinent and the later subdivision of Pakistan and Bangladesh. It has been bloody. It has been horrific. We have been the victims of genocides, particularly in Bosnia. The Rohingya is a case in point. We have also been the victims of Islamophobia, whether it was in the West traditionally, but increasingly Muslims in India are facing a particular brunt that is absolutely critical for us to be looking at. In China, the Uyghur Muslims are particularly suffering as well. And so many of these battles that I speak to have historically embroiled the entire world, either by the impact of what it has caused, whether it has spurned extremism and the violence and the terror that have accompanied it and have given Islam a particular image, or through those who maintain that authoritarian dictatorships and continue to make the Muslim world an exception through a triple bypass, a bypass of democracy, of human rights, and of freedom, as if we don't deserve to have those kind of things and that we rather deserve authoritarian dictators. In all, the accomplices in our misery have also been the mediators, the suppliers of weapons to the authoritarians and to those who make war against us, have also posed themselves as the peace brokers, the ones who in their own countries and in the world stage stand for democracy, human rights, development and freedom, and call for it and say that it must be everywhere, are also the one who have enabled its snuffing out through coup d'etats, etc. And the question fundamentally is no longer about how we complain, how better we are heard by the world about the plight and the condition of the Muslims. It's the question of how do Muslims take responsibility for peace, for peacemaking, and for reshaping this Muslim condition. and getting us out of the logjams and the conflicts and the underdevelopment that have defined our condition. The question we must ask is, do we have the fundamental tools for peacemaking? And do we have the requisite space to pursue peace and to maneuver for a better dispensation for Muslims? The post-COVID world may be the exact world that we need to find A, that space, and B, to resuscitate the historical tools that Islam and Muslims have had for the mission of peacemaking and for development in the world. Because this world is beset by crises, a health crisis, crises of conflicts, crises of climate and changing patterns of the weather, the crisis of populist politics in which people are otherized, in which people are discriminated against, and that has given rise to another crisis, the explosion of bigotries, not only of racism, that's why we have Black Lives Matter, not only of anti-Semitism, not only of xenophobia, where the stranger is hated, but also of Islamophobia and many, many others like misogyny and sexism and so forth. But Islamophobia has affected us particularly. But fundamental to all of this is the economic crisis of growing inequality, of deepening poverty and underdevelopment in parts of the world. This is the moment that we have to take our destiny in our own hands. I have been involved historically in the Arab Spring, an opportunity that was missed to reshape the Muslim world, not only because we made mistakes, but also because the West feared what had been unleashed, the potential for democracy, for human rights, for freedom, and for reshaping the destiny of the Ummah at that moment. Currently, I've also been involved in conflicts in Sudan, but more recently, trying to understand how we can have a new possibility in a place like Afghanistan. We have often found an absence of tools, but an abundance of sentiment for peace, an abundance of sentiment for justice, and pious statements about all of these things. But how will we achieve it? Firstly, it must be in the rediscovery and the rededication, I think, to the soft power of Islam as a definitive rebuttal to the hard power with which we are portrayed and which often we have been sucked into. And we have met those authoritarians and imperialists on their terrain of hard power where we have the deficits, where we have the advantages of soft power. We have often not been able to utilize it in ways. And I want to, in my final section, speak about what these coordinates of soft power could be. They are many. But crucially, I want to raise 5. The first one is that the foundation of our soft power lies in Tawheed, not only in the pious statement about the unity of Allah, but the corollary that comes that the unity of God leads to the unity of creation. And that means that we must be integrated in how we view the rest of the world, other peoples who are different, other creations, the environment, whether they are animate or inanimate, whether it is the icebergs or whether it is the polar bears that could be extinct. The second coordinate of our soft power has to be justice. We must be uncompromising about justice as the lodestar. That's what we pursue. In all the conflicts, the outcome of what we do must be justice. The third coordinate has to be mercy, rahmah. It's the glue that binds us amongst ourselves, despite all our differences, and between ourselves and other people, despite our differences and even misgivings about their lifestyles and who they are and what they do. The fourth coordinate of our soft power has to be wasatiyah. Not moderation, but being in the middle. That is our anchor. If we are not in the middle and we veer towards the extremes, those who oppose us have already won. And so we've got to anchor ourselves to the middle so that we cannot be portrayed only as extremists or simply as extremists. And the fifth one that I want to raise here today is that peace, salam, silm, is the ecosystem in which we flourished. We were at our best as a civilization when we were at peace. When we were at war, the exigencies of war took place. We had armies, and we had bureaucracies to collect taxes, and we had supply lines to keep the frontiers going. But whenever we had the opportunity for peace, that's when we created civilizations. That's when the Al-Khawarizmis, the Ibn Rushds, and so many others flourished in that space and laid the foundation for what the 21st century is showing us of the magnificence of the human mind. And so, the very definition of being a Muslim is to be in Islam, to be in a state of pursuing peace. It's a philosophy. The revelation of the Quran may have occurred on the night of power, but the consequence of the revelation was peace flowing unto us until the morning. The greetings we give each other and to others is that of peace, wishing them peace and wishing peace from them. Even when the ignorant approach us, the rebuttal is waqala salama, and say to them peace. And it is our default position, because Allah says, fight them when they fight you. But if they incline to peace, you too incline to peace. And so, it's not just the existence, the philosophical existence of peace that we pursue, but it is peacemaking that becomes imperative. And therefore, we cannot outsource peace to those from the outside to come and sort out the Muslims. We have to be able to develop the tools of peacemaking within the ambit of Islam that is based on the maqasid al-Sharia, that is based on particularly the objectives and the intents of our faith. How do we pursue the love of life and not wanton destruction of life? How do we pursue human dignity? How do we pursue development for people? How do we pursue freedom, not only to say what you want to, but to also believe as you must, etc., etc. And so the peace that we need to pursue is shown also as a strategy. It is our invention, the art of war. That Surah Al-Fath, the surah of the victory, is the art of war through peace and the avoidance of war. That's what Hudaybiyah teaches us. And so what's the wisdom in there? That how do we make trade-offs? How do we compromise the secondary for the primary? How do we prioritize the long term over the short term? How do we prioritize the existence of peace over the immediacy of war? Surah Hujurat tells us that not only has Allah prescribed for us that we must enhance our understanding of each other, that we are from a single source, that we have differences amongst each other, but that we must come to know one another. That entire Surah Hujurat, the inner apartments, gives us the tools of peace to attain coexistence, to appreciate difference, and to live with the other. So when there are rumors, you must clarify them, fatabayyanu. When there are disputes, you must reconcile them. When you see difference, don't mock. And when you see something strange, suspicion in some cases is a sin. And so, my respected brothers and sisters, I believe that amongst all the many challenges, this is the opportunity for the Ummah to seize the opportunity for global harmony through bringing the Muslim soul to rest. We cannot outsource that. We've got to develop those tools for intervening and peacemaking, conflict resolution, and mediation. Those are the germane things in Islam. And so, inshallah, we are hoping that from this ISNA convention will emerge a group of peacemakers. Not namby-pamby peacemakers, but standing on the coordinates of soft power, foremost amongst them being the pursuit of justice, the behavior of mercy, and the tools for peacemaking as we go forward. Wa akhiru da'wana anil hamdulillahi rabbil alameen.
Our next speaker is Sister Amina Jandali. Amina is founding member of ING. She co-designs and develops ING's educational presentations and cultural competency seminars. Amina has delivered hundreds of presentations in schools, colleges, universities, churches, and other venues on Islam and related subjects. She's also appeared on many news outlets speaking on issues relating to American Muslims. She currently team teaches a class on Islam at San Francisco City College. Amina received her MA in Near Eastern Studies from the University of California, Berkeley, and BA in History from the University of Illinois. Amina represents the Muslim faith.
Assalamu alaikum. I was asked to speak about a topic which has long been near and dear to me, although I'm not an expert on it because I have not formally studied the topic, and that is the topic of the environment and climate change. My interest in the environment probably stems from my childhood because we used to live outside the city limits, and once a month I would accompany my father to the city landfill where we would dump our trash and we could visibly see the remnants of our consumer lifestyle. I also grew up with a love of nature and the natural world, which as an adult I've learned to appreciate even more. This session focuses on global issues, of which there are many. In fact, humanity has never been so divided over race, over nationalism, resources, power, and a whole host of other issues. Yet while we are busy fighting over these various issues, the very home that we all occupy is literally on fire. One only has to read recent headlines on a daily basis to comprehend the gravity of the situation. A recent Time magazine headline read, "The world has been on fire for the past month." As the article begins, countries across the northern hemisphere this summer are experiencing the worst wildfires in years of recorded history, with large swaths of land and entire towns in Europe, North America, and Russia consumed by flames since the start of July. From my home state of California, which has seen devastating and unprecedented wildfires in the past few years, with the fire season growing longer and more intense, to Turkey, where the most severe fires on record have burned across the country, to even northern areas such as Russia's Siberian Yakutia region, where scientists fear that the fires are destroying wetlands and causing layers of permafrost to melt. And that in turn could then release large amounts of methane, which is a powerful greenhouse gas. And in fact, according to this Time article, the fires in the area actually unleashed 505 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent into the atmosphere, which is already surpassing 2020's record for emissions released in an entire fire seasons, which is 450 megatons. All of this, of course, then contributes even more to a devastating cycle where greenhouse gases released by fires like all of these and other human activities like burning fossil fuels continue to drive up global temperatures, and that in turn leads to conditions that contribute to more fires, and the cycle continues and escalates. In fact, as I speak, some 100 fires burn across the United States alone, including the Dixie Fire here in California, which has become the state's second largest fire to date, and has sent smoke across the country as far as the East Coast. And even before the pandemic, people in the western states had become used to wearing masks to protect them from the danger of wildfire smoke, which has very serious health risks for people with asthma or other respiratory problems. One of the factors, of course, contributing to these wildfires is hot and dry weather conditions, which is a direct result of climate change. In fact, the last decade has seen records consistently broken, including this year, where places like Sicily reached 120 degrees just today. In fact, a series of heat waves have struck various parts of the world this summer and in previous summers, killing people and contributing to the wildfires. In fact, the Copenhagen-based European Environmental Agency warned this summer that climate change projections suggest substantial warming and increases in the number of heat waves, droughts, and dry spells across most of the Mediterranean area, and more generally in southern Europe, which would increase the length and severity of the fire season, the area at risk, and the probability of large fires, possibly enhancing desertification. So there are also long-term implications for these periods of warming and drought. And here in the Pacific Northwest, we saw a once-in-a-century heat wave, which raised temperatures to record levels, including reaching 121 degrees in British Columbia this summer, And these scorching temperatures and the lack of precipitation have led to drought in many parts of the world, including here in California, where dozens of communities are at risk of running out of water. And in fact, the governor just recently announced the extension of a drought emergency where 50 of the state's 58 counties are at risk. And this is, of course, putting at risk also California's critical ability to grow crops, which feed an entire nation, if not more. In fact, sometimes it's pictures that tell a story in ways that words can't. There's 3 photographs that have been circulating about Lake Oroville. First from 2017, which shows a normally full lake. The second from April of this year shows more like a wide stream. And then more recently in July, it looks almost like a dry riverbed. And in fact, just recently, the lake dropped to such low levels that they had to stop producing hydropower, which exacerbates energy shortages. And then one of the most obvious impacts of climate change is severe weather patterns that both produce extreme droughts and the opposite, extreme rainfall. So that at the same time where areas often in the same country are experiencing severe drought and wildfires, other parts are being hit with record floods, and sometimes the very same region. Another recent headline read this summer, in the aftermath of German floods, fires burn in southern Europe as rains drench London. And so this summer, Londoners were hit with almost a month's worth of rain in a few hours, twice in less than a month. And this came at the end of a heat wave that saw the United Kingdom reach its hottest temperature this year, almost 90 degrees in West London. So flooding is just as much of a risk as wildfires, and often they both hit the same area with obviously devastating consequences, with the soil being much reduced and resulting mudslides. And this is because a warming atmosphere can hold a lot more moisture, and so we're seeing an increasing number of storm events leading to flooding, with rainfall records being broken time and time again. The severity and the frequency of these floods is again a stark warning that we are not prepared to deal with climate change. And these droughts and floodings are not limited to any one part of the world. We see them from US to Europe to China, where in fact this summer flooding in the Henan province resulted in around $14 billion of destruction of both crops as well as urban infrastructure. And severe flooding also occurs in large cities, such as what we saw in London and New York City this summer, where images of passengers wading through muddy waters in New York subway system shows how huge the impact as well as the costs and the challenges facing our infrastructure. So if this isn't enough to tell us, I don't know what else can tell us, that the climate crisis is not part of some distant future. It is here, and it's been here for a long time. And for those who continue to deny or to ignore climate change because it was something that couldn't be proved, the evidence is so clear that it's impossible to ignore. And yet people, and more importantly governments, are continuing with business as usual as we collectively sleepwalk to our own doom. We see billionaires like Jeff Bezos choose to focus on space travel instead of using his billions to protect this planet. We see corporations and policymakers literally blind to the hidden economic impact of climate change while continuing to focus on short-term and immediate profits. In fact, the entire system of industrialization that has led to the very destruction of our planet is broken, it is flawed, and it needs to be reassessed in every aspect, beginning with how we look at our natural resources and the natural world, to the competitive nature of capitalism, which has resulted in many of the worst aspects of environmental degradation and destruction. The impact of climate change is most obvious with the increase in heat waves that have led to these severe droughts that impact agriculture and water supplies, but it doesn't end there. Climate change has also led to melting ice caps and glaciers at a shocking pace, which in turn leads to rising sea levels that now threaten our coastlines and islands across the world, and of course, as we've seen, increased flooding, hurricanes, cyclones, and other severe weather. And as if all of this bad news was not enough, on August 9th, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a landmark 3,500-page report based on 10 years of research by hundreds of scientists, and it was released in the midst of these global heat waves, severe droughts, flooding, and another raging fire season, which the UN Secretary General called this report Code Red for Humanity. The report obviously contained no surprises, but merely confirmed once again how extremely dire the situation is for the future of this planet. And it states that atmospheric levels of CO2 have not been this high in 2 million years, that oceans have risen an average of 8 inches over the last century, that heat waves are hotter and longer lasting, and that we are perilously close to 1.5 degrees of Celsius of warming. It confirms that the climate crisis is intensifying and that fossil fuels are indeed responsible, and that even if we were to act now to implement the most drastic measures, there will be devastating, irreversible damage to our planet, including rapidly melting ice sheets and resultant sea level rise. That means many coastal cities will be wiped out. Billions of people are already at risk from life-threatening heat waves and extreme weather, and so we have a very small window to prevent the worst-case scenario. The report also warns that if we don't immediately impose a wholesale shift in our economy away from fossil fuels with deep, rapid cuts in greenhouse gas emissions to stay below the 1.5 Celsius of warming, we will see more climate catastrophes across the world, and much sooner than we previously thought. This report must serve as a wake-up call for all of us, both individually and for our elected officials, who can no longer give this most critical issue mere lip service, but rather treat it like the dire emergency that it is. And those who often dictate policies both to politicians and the masses are corporations. And it is up to us to hold them responsible to put people before profits once and for all, if their executives and their shareholders care at all about their children and grandchildren. For it's also very clear that the terrible impact of climate change could have been avoided if we had acted earlier. And unfortunately, those who are most responsible for the policies that impact all of us are often and still more interested in lining their own wallets or getting reelected than protecting the populations they were elected to serve. And climate change is actually only one aspect, obviously the most serious aspect of environmental degradation. Additionally, over the last decade and decades, we have witnessed countless other types of damage to the environment, including the pollution of air, land, and sea, the depletion of the ozone layer, the decimation of the world's forests, including the Amazon, which is referred to as the lungs of the planet, the depletion of fertile lands, the spread of toxic chemicals and hazardous wastes, plastics filling our oceans and killing sea life, and just to name a few. We've also seen the disruption of ecosystems and the extinction and decimation of countless species, including insects that are critical to crop fertilization, such as butterflies and bees. And in fact, recent headlines, again, remind us, such as a recent headline that emperor penguin colonies face extinction due to climate change, and a video shows salmon with lesions, fungus, as rivers hit lethal temperatures. In fact, every year that passes exceeds the previous one in the severity of the problem that may be catastrophic to a point of no return in a few more years, leading perhaps to the destruction of life on Earth. So we are faced with a basic dilemma, namely that the biggest threat to ever face the human race, and indeed all species on this planet, has become a reality, and yet most people are oblivious to this threat, and societies are continuing with the status quo, as if all is as normal, literally sleepwalking to our own destruction. The situation seems almost hopeless. Yet as Muslims, we are told by a hadith that even if the day of judgment comes and we are planting a tree, that we should keep on planting it. And just reflect about this for a minute. A tree that has just been planted neither gives shade, nor wood, nor fruit, all of the common benefits that a tree provides over time. This hadith means that even if the situation seems to be entirely hopeless, one should keep on trying, not worry about the results, but only focus on playing our part. It is also incredible that this hadith, 1400 years ago, mentions the very symbol of fighting climate change, a tree. Trees are one of the main tools for countering climate change due to their ability to absorb carbon. So the challenge, yes, is insurmountable, but we have no choice to do whatever we can to mitigate climate change. The same resolve and resources that we have applied to the pandemic, which is a serious threat, but one that pales in comparison to the much more serious threat of climate change, can be applied to mitigating and adapting to climate change. There is no planet B. The Quran reminds us that this planet is in fact our only home and is our first responsibility on earth. As it says in the Quran in chapter 6, verse 165, it is He who has appointed you His vicegerents on earth and has raised some of you in rank above others. And as the hadith says, the world is green and beautiful and God has appointed you His stewards over it. We are ultimately responsible. And one of the interesting aspects of climate change is that unlike so many issues, important issues of socioeconomic and racism and the many things that divide societies, climate change impacts both the rich and the poor. But of course, disproportionately, like so many of these issues, impacts the poor, both in the US and globally. In fact, in the global south, where people contributed far less to creating this problem, since they produce far less emissions than those in the global north, they're impacted disproportionately from and have fewer resources to fight climate change. Similarly, those who live in poor neighborhoods or poor areas are far more likely to live near a power plant or a factory or areas that have been exposed to toxic waste due to the general lack of concern for those living in these areas who have less power and less of a voice. So climate change is also a human and civil rights issue that impacts communities of color, nationally and internationally. So there can be no more business as usual, for it is exactly business as usual which has created this predicament. We cannot expect the factor which got us into this predicament to get us out of it. Capitalism cannot save us from climate change. It is at the root one of the major causes of environmental destruction and climate change. A system where the overarching goal is to make a few dollars more than your competitors cannot get us out of the mess it created in the first place. And in fact, the entire world has been striving to model itself after the very industrialized world that we have seen develop over the last couple of centuries. The irony is that it is exactly that industrialization that has led to the situation that we find ourselves in today. And the only saving grace is that much of the world is still unable to catch up with industrialization and modernity. Imagine if everyone on Earth had 2 cars and lived the same lifestyle as those in the so-called developed world. In fact, the 2 countries who produce the most carbon are China at 28% and the United States at 15%, followed by India, Russia, and Japan. That means that the 330 million people who live in this country produce a little over half the emissions of a country with, for instance, 1.6 billion people in China, and multiple times the emissions of countries like Indonesia, which produces 2%, or Turkey, that produces 1%, that has about a fourth of our population. So as Americans, we are contributing disproportionately to this global challenge and impacting people from countries who contributed minimally to creating this problem, which is a double injustice towards people who live without the various technologies we all enjoy, but often pay a higher price in terms of the impact. As the greatest historical contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, the United States must be the leader in cutting emissions by at least 50% by 2030, and that needs to begin now. We have the technology to do this. We just need the political will. And in fact, right now, Congress has an opportunity to pass legislation that will help to curb global warming pollution and put us back on track to carbon neutrality by 2050. We have seen the result of inaction, and we can't let that happen again. It is an ethical, economic, and moral imperative to protect our planet. As people of faith, we need to lead this effort, we need to act now, and we need to encourage others to work on this emergency that threatens all of our lives. We actually need to begin by reconsidering every aspect of our life and rethinking its impact, from how we live, where we live, what we eat, what we drink, what we wear, what we buy, how much we buy, our very purpose on Earth. One of the major contributors to environmental degradation is consumerism, which puts consumption and profits at the highest goals. We find that our iPhones are obsolete in a couple of years, our laptops after 5, our televisions no longer work after a decade, and we discard the very items we so long for with disdain, not giving a thought as to where they'll end up or the footprint they leave on Earth long after we are gone. We know that waste is prohibited in the Quran, as it says in chapter 7, verse 31, "O children of Adam, wear your beautiful apparel at every time and place of prayer. Eat and drink, but waste not by excess, for God does not love the wasters." And we're told that even when you're making wudu in a stream, to use moderation. And yet, how much do each one of us think about waste in our consumer-driven throwaway culture, where people just shop for the fun of it to get a dopamine hit, or because products are cheap, when in reality the hidden costs of producing, transporting, and then discarding the products after their increasingly short lifespan is very high, but out of sight and mind. Every day as we order a cup of coffee, 365 paper cups a year, along with the plastic top and whatever else we order along with it, do we ever think about the carbon it produces or the waste footprint that will outlive us when we're gone? Our planet is drowning in plastic, most of which is never recycled and cannot be recycled. It's filling the oceans, killing our sea life, clogging our streams. Every single time we buy a product that comes in plastic, we are leaving behind a footprint that will likely long outlive us. Do we consider this when we make a purchase? In fact, our clerks will usually hand us a plastic bag before we even ask for one, totally clueless as to the disaster that we're all collectively creating. Perhaps people have given up, perhaps people never don't care it in the first place, or perhaps people just don't want to think about it. But we have the duty to think about it, and we have the technical capacity and the will to solve this problem, just as we are today solving the problem of the pandemic. We need our best and our brightest, especially in the fields of science and economics, to apply the same efforts they used to bring us into the industrial age, which has resulted in climate change. We need them to apply their joint acumen to help tackle it. And if they don't, unfortunately, nothing else that we do as humans really matters, because the world that we live in will no longer be inhabitable. So we must act now, individually and collectively, by number one, educating ourselves about the issues, number two, supporting politicians and elected officials who prioritize climate issues and policies, and voting against those who continue to prioritize corporate profits over the future of our planet. That means in particular supporting the Green New Deal, which moves our country away from fossil fuel dependency towards sustainable energy. And we need to support those who support this and vote out those who are working against it. We must support groups like Amnesty International, who views this as a human rights issue and who are fighting for the voiceless, who are often disproportionately impacted by climate change and environmental degradation. We need to vote out politicians who put corporate greed over our grandchildren's future, and support environmental groups financially and as members, remaining informed and engaged on the issue. We need to educate ourselves and follow through individually with ways to reduce our own carbon footprints, such as many of the lessons that we learned during COVID by driving less, learning that we don't have to meet in person. We can meet on Zoom. We don't have to drive long distances for staff or other meetings. We don't need a closet full of clothing. In fact, most of us have closets that are overflowing and houses that are filled with junk due to our addiction to shopping. We also learned that we don't have to purchase unnecessary things, because whether they're cheap or not, they're still using energy and resources. We need to recycle or give away items we don't use and shop for secondhand green items or products made of recycled materials. We need to live a more simple life, and that's one of the lessons I think we have all learned during this pandemic, that people can be happy cooking, growing their own gardens, being more thoughtful about their approach to food, buying organic foods, locally grown foods, fresh foods, avoiding meat, which is actually not a sunnah, and it was never part of human tradition to eat meat 3 or 4 times a week, let alone a day. And of course, avoiding food waste, which is forbidden in our tradition, and unfortunately, 40% of our food ends up in the landfill. Another positive outcome of the pandemic is that people are walking more. They're engaging with nature more. Our natural world is a precious gift that we cannot compare to anything that is man-made, and we need to appreciate and preserve it before it is gone. And last but not least, we must engage with the power of dua, because Allah can produce miracles, and it is up to us to ask. So let us all pledge today to do all in our power to save our planet for the future of our children and our grandchildren, because at the end of the day, we are all accountable for planting that tree. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Our final speaker is Professor John Esposito. John Esposito is a university professor, as well as professor of religion and international affairs and Islamic studies at Georgetown University. Professor Esposito is founding director of the Al-Walid Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding in the Walsh School of Foreign Service. Previously, he was Loyola Professor of Middle East Studies, College of the Holy Cross, past president of the American Academy of Religion and Middle East Studies of North America. Esposito has served as consultant to the U.S. Department of State and other agencies, European and Asian governments, corporations, universities, and media worldwide, and as an ambassador for the UN Alliance of Civilizations. He was also a member of the World Economic Forum's Council of 100 Leaders and EC European Network of Experts on De-Radicalization.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm delighted to be meeting with you today. I wish we were doing this live, but I think it's safer and much better to do what we're doing in this context. And for those of you that hear this and would like to follow up with me, feel free to email me. Not necessary, but feel free to. You may get a message that says that I get a lot of messages and I can't answer them all, but if you tell me that you were at this session, I'd be happy to respond. So let's get going with the program today. I want to talk about a renewed commitment and the need for it to promoting global harmony. In 2021, as we look back and as we look forward, we find reasons for deep concerns as well as some hope for change. As this presentation will address, in America as well as throughout the world, there are many, many challenges. One for us is reflected in a report from the Public Religion Research Institute that stated no religious, social, or racial and ethnic group was perceived as facing greater discrimination in the U.S. than Muslims. The FBI has identified America's number one domestic threat today as the exponential growth of racism and xenophobia of the far right, white nationalist supremacist movements, and their militias who are driven by hatred of people of color, Jews, Muslims, and immigrants. An ISPU report notes these statements are no surprise for Muslims as well as Jews, who in 2020 are most likely to report experiencing discrimination. Over the past 5 years, Muslims' experience of discrimination has remained steady, ranging from 60% to 62%, while the Jewish experience has increased over time from 38% in 2017 to 58%. So you can see the way in which Islamophobia and anti-Semitism have increased in disconcerting proportions. However, in institutional settings, Muslims are more likely than other groups to report experiencing religious discrimination at an airport, restaurant, on a plane, in a public place, as well as experiencing it when applying for a job or interacting with peers at work or school. In addition, half of Muslim families report religious-based bullying, twice as likely as the general public, and that's important. That gets bypassed. You would see it in an occasional media story, but the realities for young Muslims, when you're talking about 50% experiencing bullying, is problematic, especially when you consider that the community is so much more integrated than it was decades ago. In America, the rapid growth of Islamophobia and far-right nationalism and populism has had a significant impact on our politics, our foreign policy, and has caused a dangerous increase in racial, religious, and ethnic politics, discrimination and violence, not only in the US, but we see it in Europe as well. But we also see it in the erosion of democracy and rise of ethnic and religious nationalism in India, Kashmir, China, Myanmar, Tibet, Sri Lanka, and beyond. Let's keep in mind what we saw most recently during the Trump administration. We had a candidate, Trump, who said Islam hates us. When asked if he meant some Muslims, many Muslims, he simply repeated, Islam hates us, and lots of them do. He also talked about the prospect of monitoring mosques and definitely was advocating a Muslim ban, which he then put in. He moved aggressively with regard to blocking immigrants, Muslims and non-Muslims, from entering the country. This was a swing to the right that we're still grappling with. And it underscores the danger and the need to address it. Now, when we actually look at other parts of the world, let's say Europe and Asia, today, far-right political parties in the United Kingdom, France, Austria, Germany, Denmark, Norway, Netherlands, Hungary, Poland, you can name many, have had significant election performances, have done well, these minority parties, and occasionally majority parties. They espouse a very clear xenophobic, anti-Muslim, and anti-immigrant extremism in their rhetoric, the kind of political platforms that they have, and in their policies. If you're interested in this, you should go to bridge.georgetown.edu. That's bridge.georgetown.edu. This is a project that we run out of the center. It's called The Bridge: Protecting Pluralism, Ending Islamophobia. And you will find fact sheets that document the things that I'm talking about. What have American politicians been saying about Muslims? And what has the net effect been? What has been going on in Myanmar, in China, etc., to get a sense of the magnitude of this problem. Over a period of 7 to 10 years, there are some estimates that more than $250 million had been given by folks in the U.S. to these anti-Muslim writers and websites. Increasingly, what we've also seen is that mainstream political parties have begun to swing to the right in countries like France, Austria, and Germany. They use terms like political Islam. They don't distinguish between the term political Islam as simply meaning politics and being concerned about the political sphere in Islam. And that can take on many different pictures, and depending on the venue, the country. Are you in a Muslim country or in a non-Muslim country, etc.? But they also tie that into a sense of separatism, an implication that the faith of Islam and that many Muslims are really going to prove to be separatists. So therefore, they're not going to be able to really be good citizens. That is, they're not be able to be good French persons, German persons, Austrians. They're not going to, judging them by that somehow they're not really fully accepting that sense of identity and culture, etc. And indeed, what some are calling for is simply a letting go rather than a bringing together, as we have done in our better periods in both Europe and America, where people were part of a multicultural society. In this case, you have more people that want to argue for a monocultural society. So you, the new people who are coming in, should basically, ideally, they look like us, talk like us, prefer our food, have all of our cultural traits. In other words, be culturally absorbed rather than allowing for actually a healthy form of diversity, a diversity that can be a strength rather than a weakness. And they use this as a means to discredit, control, and suppress mainstream Muslim communities, organizations, their schools. They brand them as a grave threat to European identity and society. In places like Austria, they will ask people, parents, do they pray at night? Do they cover their head? These kinds of comments that are referring to religious practice as if somehow that makes one not a good citizen. As a result, in the name of protecting the state, the country's identity, culture, and constitution, we have seen police and security raids impacting Muslim civil society, mosque organizations, religious leaders, scholars in France, in Austria, and in Germany. In the Middle East, the Arab Spring and democratically elected governments in Egypt and now Tunisia have been overthrown in coups. Authoritarianism has become even more entrenched in Arab monarchies. And more than that, has been exported and funded by countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. A clear case was their support for the coup, both the planning before the coup in Egypt and after the coup, funding into billions and billions of dollars. and ignoring of Tunisia, and more recently being involved in what moved into a coup in Tunisia. In Asia, Islamophobia and the erosion of democracy can be seen in the Uyghur genocide in China, the genocide of the Rohingya in Myanmar. We're talking to millions of people here. And in India, the Modi government, a government in a so-called secular democracy, and that's what India was supposedly founded as. The Modi government and the BJP's attempt to transform India's secular democracy into a Hindu nationalist state. This has led to increased discrimination, violence, the marginalization of Muslim Christian communities. You had members of the government blaming Muslims for the COVID outbreak, for example. And you had basically some rioting that took place, violence, etc. So in the midst of all of this, where do we go from here? As we face our future, sadly, COVID-19 and the threat from the Delta variant, as well as the rise of this right-wing populism, and a world of climate crisis, in a world of climate crisis that is often denied by many, who deny the very science of it, but also a climate crisis that we know from experts we can only try to improve, will never be able to overtake because it's so far along. These are mega global threats that need the attention of all of us today and in the future. Responding to these challenges requires building bridges of understanding among all people, people of faith, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs, and people of no faith, among all citizens, to gather together to create the necessary degree of global harmony and information and cooperation to be able to solve these issues. Playing a powerful role in our society is only possible once a community has been integrated in and able to make a difference among peoples of all races, ethnicities, and genders. You can't do it alone. The growing strength of the Muslim community in America and in parts of Europe can be seen in their educational, economic, and political development, as well as their integration into Western societies and their functioning and working proudly as citizens in those societies, even amidst the continued challenges to their religion and their identity. Muslims' growing power to integrate in American society, for example, and their ability to summon up the optimism about the future and play a critical role in addressing all of our challenges is due to a number of factors, which are documented by current studies and demographics. The Muslim population in America is young, remarkably young. 59% are between the ages of 18 and 39. That's almost 60% of the population between the ages of 18 and 39, compared to just 39% of those in the general public. Many young Muslim males and females emphasize education, are highly educated. Muslims are second to religious Jews in terms of emphasis on education and level of education. 31% of Muslims are full-time students. That's more than threefold difference, more than 3 times above the U.S. general population. 3 times. A quarter, 25% of U.S. Muslims are enrolled in college, compared to just 13%, 25% versus 13% of the general public. Muslim women, 73% of them, were even more likely than Muslim men to pursue higher educations, and a equal number of Muslim males and females, not numerically equal, but meaning many, have university degrees and continue to have university degrees. Education is emphasized very strongly in families. Muslim employment profiles today span the socioeconomic spectrum. So you see an example of how many groups before came and were invisible, had to adjust to their societies. Many had to work in positions that would not have been desirable. But today, we see Muslims as physicians, lawyers, engineers, educators, corporate executives, small business owners, government officials, blue-collar workers, and laborers. A Pew survey reported that Muslim Americans were about as likely as the general public to live in a household with an income of $100,000 a year or above. Gallup found that 70%, the highest of any religious group surveyed, had a job. 70%. And this percentage is also above the 64% reported for the general population. A full 30% of employed Muslims were in the professions. 30% were in the professions. 4 percentage points ahead of the U.S. general population. Muslim self-employment, 24% of Muslims are self-employed. That's the highest among any religious group, and 7 percentage points above the general population. So do we see Muslims integrated in our society, culturally, economically, professionally? Yes. And in many areas, surprisingly, relative to their size and the number of years that they've been here, out in front. Such information about Muslim youth, education, financial stability, and potential to succeed in American culture, despite concerns about Islamophobia and its impact on them, enable American Muslims overwhelmingly to say they are proud to be Americans, believe that hard work generally brings success in this country, and are satisfied with their own lives. Most were happier than the broader U.S. population with the conditions in American society and their sense of their future, even as 50 to 52% talked about themselves or friends experiencing discrimination. Muslims today are part of the fabric of American society, and they are learning to assert their citizenship and fundamental rights as America's constitutional heritage encourages and requires. Muslim integration also empowers them to make significant contributions to their broader community, contributions that become more and more needed in our challenging times. 1/3 of Muslims report of working on community issues and donating to local charities. Muslim physicians operate free medical clinics for everyone. And many Muslims and Muslim organizations provide monetary and personal support for natural disaster relief and community disasters. Muslims have also promoted religious pluralism and tolerance, again showing a community that, as it puts itself within our pluralistic society, has been able to demonstrate the extent to which their rich tradition also can include and reach out and not simply exclude. 90% of all American Muslims say that Muslims should participate in interfaith activities. And I can tell you, I was active in interfaith activities from its very beginning in the U.S., and it took decades before you'd have religious communities that would have that kind of percentage. And 85% of American Muslims said the influence of religion and moral values in American public life should increase, that Muslims should strongly emphasize shared values with believing Christians and Jews, and that they worship the same God as Christians and Jews. That raises a real question with regard to many of the right-wingers, especially those that are far-right conservative Christians, and simply see their faith as the only true faith, and demonize other religions, including Islam and Muslims. Muslim participation in political life in the U.S. has increased significantly over the years. Muslims have participated in presidential, state, and local campaigns, supporting non-Muslim as well as Muslim candidates. Muslim candidates have increased in national as well as local elections. Keith Ellison, now the Attorney General of Minnesota, was the first Muslim elected to Congress in 2006. Currently, there are 3 Muslims in Congress. Andre Carson, elected in 2008 from Indiana, Ilhan Omar, 2019 from Minneapolis, and Rashida Tlaib, 2019 from Dearborn. Muslim integration, therefore, in American society is an important trend moving through the 21st century. Gallup, Pew, ISPU polls have tracked the integration of Muslims in America. Report that American Muslims can be described as largely middle class and mainstream. At the same time, a significant minority in the last decade, at least in the last decade, are now in the upper ranks of society because of their successes, whether as physicians or in Silicon Valley. This status empowers Muslims to join diverse sectors of society and interest groups. Muslim and non-Muslim interfaith organizations, as well as other interest groups, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and many others, to foster a healthy and constructive civic, religious, and political pluralism. As we shrink more and swing into a kind of rightist position that basically wants to define America or France, for example, as white, as narrowly one language, as representing one specific culture, which of course isn't the case to begin with, and therefore excludes anything else as foreign and feels that anything that's other than that has to become completely absorbed and give up its language, even preferably its religion, and still would have a problem when it would come to its color or its race or its ethnicity. In that situation, it breeds then what we see at times, this increase of anti-Muslim and anti-Semitic groups, which have grown and have threatened our society, not only in their rhetoric and in their politics, but in their acts of violence. The attacks against Jewish synagogues in Pittsburgh, the attacks against Muslim mosques in the United States, or personal attacks against individual Muslims. All of those things have to be dealt with. And it's important that, therefore, there be a diverse group of progressive organizations and sectors of our society, religious and civil society groups, organizations that have opposed the far right and continue. They become a block. It's got to be government as well as far right. And it's got to be also our police and security people. The ultimate reality of globalization, therefore, is that we all live in and share our planet. It's not just about my country and whether or not my country is the greatest country and then everybody else has to just measure up and I don't have to care about what's going on in the world. We all live on a single planet with countries, people, and all of the creatures involved. If for some there is a devastating problem, all can be affected. And we've seen that time and time. Go back to the problem with HIV, go to Ebola. Certainly now with COVID, the extent to which something is seen as coming out of China and has become global in scope, global in its spread, global in the number of deaths, etc. That kind of interconnection has to be, we need to take that more and more seriously. The same is certainly true of climate change. What happens if there's grave climate change in one area of the country, it affects another area of the country, and it can affect another area of the world. And we all have seen these examples. So we're all interconnected as global citizens, politically, internationally, economically, environmentally. And as we see so tragically with COVID today, medically. Together then, we must all work to address issues that threaten all nations, all ethnicities, religions, and economic classes. Whether it's the erosion of democracy, which is taking place very widely. You can look at the Freedom House reports on that erosion. And in their latest ones, they point out for the first time that it's a major issue with regard to the United States, that certainly during the Trump administration and the extent to which Trump was wanting to work cheek by jowl with the leader of China, the leader of the Philippines, with the leader of North Korea, that the signal that was sent by that, and then the repercussions, that erosion of democracy that then led to what occurred on the 6th of January at the Capitol. That erosion of democracy that has raised profound questions about racism and human rights in America and in many countries in the globe, that has raised profound questions about global poverty, national poverty, and the relationship to social justice. That global connection that we see with the pandemics, and as I said before, with climate change, but also with the threat of violence and terrorism. One need only think, depending on the country, and I've referred to some of the violence, but if you look at our country, when it comes to anti-Semitic actions and anti-Muslim actions, it's not just that people announce, it's not just that people get on the internet and social media, it's that some of these people get on and they advocate and they cause violence and terror. I've experienced that in terms of death threats, in terms of needing security at times in places where I've been speaking and where others have been speaking, things that should not be occurring in our democracy, let alone the less we adhere to our democracy, it can tend to seem to advance a sense that the other should be marginalized and that the other should be seen as dangerous, etc. And we certainly see that in spades, as I've said before, occurring in a place like China, where you have millions of people put in the equivalent of concentration camps. The Chinese call them education camps. The Rohingya, more than 1 million being driven out and living in appalling circumstances in Bangladesh. And when we look at the impact of climate change and the threat of violence and terrorism that exist at home and abroad, this is not what we want to see for ourselves. It's not what we want to see for our children and for the next generation. But when I say what we want to see for ourselves and our children and the next generation, I don't mean our as in just America. I mean our as in globally, because we are world citizens. Thank you. It's been a pleasure getting to talk with you, and I hope that you have a very good experience with the rest of this conference.
Welcome to the 58th Annual ISNA Convention. Reimagine and rebuild with renewed resolve.